My name is Jim Tierney, and I am the director of the National State Attorney General program at Columbia Law School. For 10 years before that, I was the Attorney General of my home state of Maine. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the basic operations and functions of the position of State Attorney General. We supplement this presentation with an AG 101 portal on our website, stateag.org, and we've loaded some materials there, more detailed, more footnoted, if you will, materials that'll help you follow along. So it's my job to give you the 50,000-foot perspective on the Office of Attorney General. Now, these views are my own, and they're not designed to give specific legal or policy advice about any specific state, because the states vary a great deal. But I hope that if you stick with me for the next 25 minutes, you'll come away with a better grasp of how the entire operation works. Now, about, 20, 30 years ago, there was a movie called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And in that movie, Robert Redford and Paul Newman play two 19th century thieves who are constantly being followed by some very skilled law enforcement officials. And as Redford and Newman try to get away from the posse, they keep looking over their shoulder and say, who are these guys? I mean, who are these guys? And that's the question that I get most often in dealing with attorneys general, from lawyers, non-lawyers, anyone who tends to cover state government, state constitutional issues. Just who are these guys? At any given time, one or two of them seem to be, purely ideological, but the rest of them, why don't they just act like politicians are supposed to act? I mean, they're elected statewide. They raise millions of dollars for their campaigns. They have to keep interest groups happy. They have to keep state legislators happy. They have to operate within a budget. And why don't they just act like everyone else? But when you start dealing with attorneys general, many times people come away mystified. You find Republicans doing things that are traditionally liberal. You find Democrats doing things traditionally conservative. And when you walk into a room and they're all together, they actually don't hate each other. They seem to genuinely enjoy each other's company. And this seems so different than the whole expectation that we have of the American political system generally. We get the question over and over, who are these guys? Well, to begin the answer to this question, we actually have to go back to the common law in England in the 1600s, at a time when the Attorney General of England became separate from the king and showed that he had a higher allegiance, an allegiance to the common law and to the law, which was more important than the allegiance to the king personally. Some of those early attorneys general paid with their lives. But that tradition followed over into the colonies and into state governments that we have today. Now, the United States Attorney General, according to our Constitution, our federal Constitution, is appointed by the President and can be removed by the President at any time for any reason. Every state except Alaska and Wyoming have rejected that model. State Attorneys General, as a result of state constitutions, case law, statutes, cannot be removed by the governor. They are constitutional officers and as such have a significant degree of independence. And this is not by accident. It's because the framers of state constitutions wanted to see some separation between the governor and the law. They didn't trust the governor. They thought the governor would over-enforce certain laws. And so, by definition, an attorney general is there saying no to the governor, saying no to the legislature, saying no to a lot of people who would like to do something which the attorney general feels exceeds their constitutional authority. And it's that independence which truly pervades the Office of Attorney General and is hard to understand. I mean, most lawyers have clients, right? So if you ask an Attorney General, who's your client? The Attorney General often will pause and say, well, my client's the public interest. And the questioner is frustrated. They say, what does that mean, the public interest? Is that just politics? Well, I'll give you my background. I've been doing this for over 30 years. I was Attorney General for 10 years, and in the years since then, I've worked carefully with hundreds of men and women who are Attorneys General and their staffs. And they've come to me with problems which are difficult to understand and difficult to parse, and I've listened confidentiality and worked my way through those problems with them. I've also read every state constitution, every statute. I've read the state Supreme Court appellate decisions that define or contract the powers of Attorney General, and I've read a lot of really bad law review articles. But I can tell you this, at the end of the day, although clearly policy is involved in the decisions and the discretion of an Attorney General, this is a position which is not just about politics. It's about trying to figure out how to do their job. Okay, what is that job? I'm going to break it down into 3 sections. The first is the jurisdiction of the Attorney General. What does the law and Constitution say they can do? And at that AG 101 portal at stateag.org, you will find some documents that define that in more detail. So after the jurisdiction, I'll ask, well, what kind of resources does an Attorney General bring to the task? How can they do all this work? How many people do they have? And then finally, we'll talk about how an Attorney General's office is organized, how they put themselves together to try to make the difficult decisions that they have to make. So let's start with the jurisdiction. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state, both at common law and by statute. And so the Attorney General has to be there when the state gets sued. And let's face it, people sue government all the time, and you're going to find an assistant attorney general going into court on behalf of state government and state agencies on a regular basis to defend the state when it is a defendant. Attorneys general also enforce statutes. They enforce them in the name of a client agency, or if we're talking about consumer and antitrust or charities where there really isn't a client agency, the attorney general enforces those laws in his or her name. And the AGs do more than that. They provide informal advice and formal opinions to state government. And in almost every state, attorneys general have some degree of criminal jurisdiction. They enforce the criminal laws, either alone or in conjunction with federal and other local law enforcement officials. But even that doesn't say it all. Let's take an example. Let's say you're in a state where the legal jurisdiction shows that the Attorney General has no jurisdiction over, let's say, domestic violence. And the most brilliant lawyer of the world could research the laws and the statutes and come to the conclusion and advise clients the Attorney General has no jurisdiction over domestic violence. And that lawyer would be completely wrong. Because even though the Attorney General may not have written jurisdiction, the Attorney General can do all kinds of things. The Attorney General can hold a press conference. The Attorney General can appoint a task force. The Attorney General can pose legislation and testify in front of legislative or congressional bodies. The Attorney General can work with AGs in other states. The Attorney General could do a domestic violence education initiative through the schools or through various publications. So this is my way of saying that the Attorney General's job exceeds any specific statute if the Attorney General believes in his or her heart that this is what the state's public interest needs. The Attorney General can have jurisdiction, oftentimes by simply asserting it, by climbing up into that bully pulpit and letting the people of their state know what they believe. So that's jurisdiction. Whoa, how do you do that? That's a big job. There are between 13 and 14,000 assistant attorneys general in the United States. And AG offices also have police who are assigned to them, law enforcement, sworn law enforcement officials. They have sometimes accountants or economists working in their charities or antitrust divisions. And of course they have my favorite, they have law librarians. So in addition to these staff, how do they set forth to do their jobs? Is there a budget you can turn to? Well, state government appropriates about directly through the legislature about 30 to 40% of the budget of an attorney general. That's a surprise to people. They'll say, where's the budget? Let me take a look at it. Well, it's sort of there for about 35 to 40%. But where does the rest of the money come from? Well, the money comes from federal grants. Every state attorney general, for example, has a Medicaid fraud division, which has a lot of federal funding to it. Same with their environmental protection units. In consumer and antitrust, attorney general offices are increasingly funded as a result of settlements. They actually charge legal fees. But most of the money comes from charging those state agencies that they represent when the agency gets sued. So the Attorney General's budget might actually show up over in the Department of Corrections or the State Highway Department, who may have been sued because they misdesigned a road or a bridge and someone got hurt and the state got sued. Now, sometimes state attorneys general hire outside counsel. In fact, they all hire outside counsel for something. Usually it's routine and you don't notice it. Say, for example, there's a case in a very rural part of the state, far away from the state capital, and you don't want to put an assistant attorney general in the car and drive them for 3 hours to handle a routine matter, so you hire outside counsel. Or you may hire outside counsel for routinized functions, such as bill collection. Or you may have a complicated copyright case that arises out of representing a university, and again, you'd want a copyright specialist. But increasingly, states are hiring outside counsel on big national cases. We're seeing, for example, when the states got together to sue the tobacco industry in the 90s, the state attorneys general hired lawyers on a contingency fee basis, a practice which continues in some states. And also, when over half the states went all the way to the United States Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, again, the states got together, chipped in, and hired outside counsel, a private law firm to represent the states in a coordinated fashion all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Okay, so I've got the jurisdiction, I've talked about the resources. Now, how does an attorney general organize an office? I mean, how do you do that? Well, even though the names and the organizational chart might look a little different, although I've got a handy one, which you'll find at that website, the truth is that AG offices actually are almost all organized the same if you look at their function. So let's step back and look at it. First, you have the Attorney General. Then you have the Chief Deputy. Then you have a Chief of Staff. You have a Solicitor General. You have someone who heads the Civil Division, someone who heads the Public Protection Division, and someone who heads the Criminal Division. Now let me walk you through each of those particular positions and try to put a little flavor to it. Who are these attorneys general? Well, they used to be kind of young, rambunctious lawyers when I served. But attorneys general now are tending to be older, have more experience, legal experience behind them. A very large percentage actually have served in the office of attorney general as a young lawyer. Almost all have some sort of prosecutorial background. They tend to stay for 4 to 8 years. Most AG offices now are term limited after 8 years. Not all, but most. And so they tend to also have had experience before, and most of them want to have experience after. These are statewide effective public officials, and many of them move on to run for governor of the United States Senate, and a number of them actually are on the judiciary. One Chief Justice of several states have come out of AG offices. So that's the Attorney General. Well, and the Attorney General wants to do things. If you get attorneys general together with a bunch of lieutenant governors, it's not hard to tell them apart. The attorneys general are the ones who come to the table and are ready to do something and want to do it right away. Well, enter the Chief Deputy. Chief Deputy Attorney General is the man or the woman who is most likely to tell the Attorney General, no, you can't do it. The Chief Deputy has to assemble the law, the policy, the budget, has to compare different stakeholders, and has to be an excellent administrator. Now, chief deputies occasionally run for attorney general themselves. In Indiana, in Idaho, and Utah today, the attorney general is a former chief deputy. But that's unusual. But we're also seeing some chief deputies stay on from one attorney general to the next, even when there's a party change. We've seen that recently in Washington, we've seen it in Maine, we've seen it in Georgia, where even though there's a party change at the top, the new attorney general goes, no, I got to keep this chief deputy. They know what's going on, and they'll be square with me. So the chief deputy is not seen as something which is political and necessarily comes out of the partisan side of the business. Well, if the chief deputy is saying no to the attorney general, who's saying yes? That would be the chief of staff. The chief of staff is a man or a woman, oftentimes with a political background, oftentimes came from the campaign of the attorney general or comes out of the legislature. They may not even be a lawyer, But their job is to supervise the policy of the Attorney General, to make sure that the interest groups are informed, to deal with legislative initiatives, to deal with the press. Oftentimes falls within the chief of staff, and usually if someone's trying to lobby an attorney general, they usually get sent to the chief of staff's office. So right away you see friction, right? You see friction between the chief deputy saying no, and you see the chief of staff trying to say yes, and the attorney general being the decider, because AG officers are not democracies. The attorney general makes final decisions, usually alone. So who comes next in this kind of hierarchy? And that's where we go to the position of Solicitor General. Now, Solicitor General is, well, for want of another word, is the big brain in the office. This is the lawyer who really gets the constitutional and subtle, complex legal arguments that are confronting state government. These are the men and women who are on law review, and the career trail for solicitor generals is usually to become a law professor or to become a judge, and which is happening in both cases with increasing frequency. Now, this job is a small office. There aren't many people in the Solicitor General's office, but they review briefs not only from around the office, but from around the country. And they advise on amicus decisions before the United States Supreme Court. And remember, states appear in front of the United States Supreme Court more than any other entity except the federal government itself. So the Solicitor General's office, small, thoughtful, and a very powerful position. Okay, AG, Chief Deputy, Chief of Staff, Solicitor General. Where do we go next? Here we go to the Civil Division. The Civil Division, or the Government Bureau, is the largest division in the office. Here we have dozens and dozens of lawyers who are trying to defend the state, but the state gets sued. And this is hard for an Attorney General or that Chief of Staff or the public protection person who has a strong ideological view about how government should work, because lots of times, look, you're a defense lawyer. You're taking care of the state when the state's made mistakes. And so Civil Division directors usually come up through the ranks. They know how state government works. They have a good sense of the Administrative Procedures Act. They're never sufficiently funded. And most civil deputies I know sort of have sloped shoulders because they're always getting beat up on by everybody else. Okay, that's a Civil Division. Who's the friction to them? You got it. Public protection. Public protection is the AG's white hat. There's no agency here. There's no, the Attorney General gets to say, I see this wrongdoing and I want to stop it. And they use very broad consumer protection statutes or antitrust statutes, which is a very sweeping authority given to state attorneys general as a result of federal law. And AGs get probably 95% of their publicity from the consumer division, which may make up maybe 3 or 4% of the actual members of their staff, but they're very powerful positions. And you can see the Civil Division fighting with the Public Protection Division pretty easily. Okay, we've got one senior person in the office left. We've got all of these people. We've got Chief of Staff, Solicitor General, AG, Civil, Public Protection, but there's one division which stands alone, and that's the Criminal Division. Every state doesn't have sweeping criminal authority, but the public thinks they do. The public is sure that the Attorney General really has the ultimate word on criminal prosecution. And even that perception itself, remember my earlier example of domestic violence, oftentimes sways beyond the actual four corners of the jurisdiction. But AGs do have a lot of criminal jurisdiction. In states like Rhode Island and Alaska and Delaware, there are no district attorneys. The Attorney General does the whole thing. But in most states, it's shared. It's shared with district attorneys. In 16 states, the Attorney General runs a statewide grand jury, for example. Every state has a Medicaid fraud unit, which contains a criminal component on the important issue of Medicaid fraud. AGs handles appellate cases in some areas. This brings AGs into the whole area of the death penalty. And in some states, an AG will have a special unit that sort of rides circuit into the rural parts of the state if there's a significant crime or a complicated crime that occurs where there's maybe only a few part-time prosecutors in trying to do the job. So AGs have very broad criminal jurisdiction, and of course prosecution of the criminal law must and has to be separate from the electoral process and the election process. And believe me, when the Criminal Division gets in the news, which it doesn't very often, it really does. The recent prosecution by the Pennsylvania Attorney General of Jerry Sandusky and the child abuse scandals that came out of Penn State, that gives you an example of when an AG's office gets in the news on a criminal issue. It's a big one. Well, that's about it. I've given you the jurisdiction, resources, and how an AG's office organizes itself. But AGs also exist on the national plane, and they are fortunate to have an organization, the National Association of Attorneys General, located in Washington, D.C. All the states join it. It's nonpartisan. And the AGs meet formally with that group 3 times a year. But the subcommittees also meet. So all the AGs know each other. All the chief deputies know each other. All the solicitor generals know each other. So if you're advocating in front of an AG's office, be careful what you say to one state, because you may actually be saying it to a lot of states. They're just an email away. NAG, the National Association of Attorneys General, is a terrific organization. It has a fabulous website, and it brings AGs together in a way which is sort of unparalleled today in the American political system. It's something that's, I think any of us who've worked with NAG can feel very proud that we have done so. There are also partisan organizations. There's the Republican AGs Association, the Democratic AGs Association. These are fundraising operations. They have policy meetings. And for a fee, you get to go and meet and talk to attorneys general and their senior staffs as part of our electoral system. 43 attorneys general elected statewide. We all know that it costs a lot of money to do that, and so that's part of what they do. RAGA and DAGA. You can figure out the acronyms and work accordingly. Now, there are a lot of issues that continue to stream through AG offices, from human trafficking and domestic violence, which I mentioned earlier, but huge issues dealing with high tech and internet crime and child predators, and also issues that grow and fade away. Issues that may have been pressing 5 years ago seem to be less important today. But I'm not going to go into all of those. We've gone through enough today. This is AG 101. This is the end of our class. Thank you for listening.